There's a moment when you realize that the person who talks the most in the room has the least power, the one explaining themselves constantly, defending their position, trying to convince everyone of their worth. Meanwhile, the person who speaks 3 sentences commands the entire conversation. You've been lied to about influence. Society taught you that charismatic speakers, eloquent debaters, and verbose leaders are the most powerful. But Machiavelli knew better. He observed that the most dangerous people in any room are those who say the least, but choose their words like weapons. Think about the most influential people you've encountered. Not the loudest, not the most talkative, the ones whose few words carried weight, the ones who made you lean in when they finally spoke, the ones whose silence felt more powerful than others' speeches. Words are not just communication, they're currency. And like any currency, the more you spend, the less valuable each unit becomes. When you speak constantly, your words become worthless. When you speak selectively, each word becomes precious. This isn't about becoming silent or antisocial. This is about understanding that influence operates through scarcity, not abundance. The person who floods conversations with words drowns their own power. The person who portions out their words strategically becomes irresistible to listen to. Today you'll discover why saying less makes people listen more, why explanations weaken your position while statements strengthen it, why the most powerful weapon in any conversation isn't what you say, it's what you choose not to say. Machiavelli understood that power flows toward those who appear to know secrets. And nothing suggests hidden knowledge more than calculated silence. When you speak less, people assume you know more. When you explain less, they respect you more. When you defend less, they believe you more. The verbose person reveals their hand. The strategic speaker makes others guess. And in the game of influence, whoever keeps people guessing holds all the cards. Let's establish a brutal truth about human psychology. People value what's scarce and ignore what's abundant. This principle doesn't just apply to diamonds and gold. It applies to your words. When you speak constantly, you train people to tune you out. When you speak selectively, you train them to listen carefully. Think about your past conversations. The person who talked nonstop, who had an opinion about everything, who filled every silence with words. How much attention did you actually pay to them? Now think about someone who spoke rarely, but precisely. When they finally said something, didn't you listen more intently? This happens because of how our brains process information. We have limited attention, and we unconsciously allocate it based on perceived value. If someone speaks constantly, our brain categorizes their words as low-value background noise. But if someone speaks rarely, our brain assumes their words must be important. Machiavelli observed this in every court he studied. The advisors who constantly offered opinions were treated as background noise. The ones who spoke only when directly asked, or when they had something genuinely important to say, were treated as wise counselors, whose words carried weight. The psychology runs even deeper. When you speak less, you create information gaps that other people feel compelled to fill. Human beings are uncomfortable with silence and uncertainty. We need to fill conversational voids. So when you remain quiet, others start talking more, revealing their thoughts, their fears, their desires. This is how you gain strategic information without asking for it. While the talkative person reveals everything about themselves, the strategic speaker learns everything about others. You become a psychological magnet, drawing out confessions, admissions, and insights that people wouldn't normally share. Verbal scarcity also creates an aura of mystery. When people can't predict what you're thinking, when they can't read your intentions through constant verbal output, you become intriguing. Mystery generates respect because it suggests depth. People assume that someone who speaks little must have profound thoughts worth hearing. Contrast this with verbal abundance. The person who explains everything, who shares every thought, who fills every pause with words, becomes predictable. Predictable people lose their mystique. Without mystique, there's no intrigue. Without intrigue, there's no influence. The math is simple. More words equal less power per word. Fewer words equal more power per word. When you understand this equation, you stop trying to convince people through volume and start influencing them through precision. You stop explaining yourself into weakness and start commanding attention through strategic silence. Most people talk too much because they mistake explanation for persuasion. They believe that if they can just find the right words, the right arguments, the right explanations, they can convince anyone of anything. But this belief comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of how influence actually works. We're conditioned from childhood to believe that more words equal better communication. In school, longer essays got better grades. In presentations, filling time was valued over making points. Society taught us that verbal fluency equals intelligence and that articulation equals authority. But society was wrong, because society doesn't understand the difference between communication and influence. Communication is about transferring information. Influence is about changing behavior. And behavior change happens through emotions and subconscious triggers, not through logical arguments and detailed explanations. When you talk too much, you're usually doing one of three things: defending, explaining, or convincing. All three are positions of weakness. When you defend, you acknowledge that you're under attack. When you explain, you admit that your position isn't clear. When you convince, you reveal that you need their approval. The powerful person doesn't defend, they dismiss. They don't explain, they state. They don't convince, they command. Not through arrogance, but through the confidence that comes from understanding that influence operates through certainty, not uncertainty. Talking too much also reveals your emotional state. When you're nervous, you fill silence with words. When you're insecure, you over-explain your decisions. When you're desperate, you try to convince through volume. All of these behaviors communicate weakness to the subconscious mind of your listener. Machiavelli noticed that powerful leaders spoke in statements, not arguments. They declared their intentions rather than debating their merits. They assumed compliance rather than begging for agreement. This wasn't because they were naturally more confident. It was because they understood that confidence can be performed through verbal restraint. Here's what happens when you talk too much. You give people too many opportunities to disagree with you. Every additional sentence is another chance for their mind to find fault, to raise objections, to resist your influence. The more you say, the more ammunition you give their resistance. But when you speak less, you give people fewer targets to attack. Your statements become harder to argue with because there's less material to work with. Your position appears stronger because it seems like you've thought it through completely and arrived at an unshakable conclusion. The paradox is this: the more you try to convince someone through words, the less convinced they become. But the less you try to convince them, the more convincing you appear, because conviction is communicated through certainty, not through explanation. Silence isn't the absence of communication. It's the most powerful form of communication. When used strategically, silence can do what 1,000 words cannot. It can make people doubt themselves, reveal their true intentions, and elevate your status in their minds. There are 3 types of strategic silence, each with specific applications. The first is processing silence, the pause you take before responding to any question or statement. This pause communicates that you're considering your words carefully, that your response will be thoughtful rather than reactive. It also makes others uncomfortable, which often causes them to add more information while you remain quiet. The second is pressure silence, the silence you maintain after making a statement or asking a question. Instead of immediately elaborating or rephrasing, you let your words hang in the air. This forces the other person to respond to what you actually said, rather than what they think you meant. It also prevents you from weakening a strong statement with unnecessary additions. The third is power silence, the silence you use when someone is trying to provoke an emotional reaction from you. Instead of defending, explaining, or arguing back, you simply remain quiet. This silence communicates that their words don't warrant a response, which is often more devastating than any comeback you could deliver. Machiavelli observed that the most feared negotiators were those who could sit in silence while others filled the void with concessions. Silence creates psychological pressure. Most people are so uncomfortable with quiet that they'll agree to almost anything to end it. They'll reveal information they didn't intend to share. They'll make offers they didn't plan to make. Strategic silence also forces people to project meaning onto you. When you don't immediately respond, they start wondering what you're thinking. They assume you must know something. They don't. They begin to question their own position. Your silence becomes a mirror that reflects their insecurities back at them. But here's the crucial part. Strategic silence only works if it's genuine. If you're silent because you don't know what to say, people can sense that uncertainty. But if you're silent because you're choosing not to speak, that choice radiates power. The difference is in your internal state. Weak silence comes from confusion or fear. Strong silence comes from confidence and control. When you're genuinely comfortable with quiet, when you don't feel compelled to fill every pause with words, you communicate a level of self-possession that others find both attractive and intimidating. This is why powerful people are comfortable with silence. They don't need constant verbal validation. They don't fear being misunderstood. They understand that sometimes the most influential thing you can do is nothing at all. The most influential communicators don't use more words. They use better words. They understand that one precisely chosen phrase can accomplish what an hour of explanation cannot. This is the art of surgical communication, cutting straight to the core of an issue with minimal words and maximum impact. Think about the most memorable quotes in history. I have a dream. Yes, we can. Think different. None of these are lengthy explanations or detailed arguments. They're surgical strikes of language that bypass the conscious mind and embed themselves directly into memory and emotion. Precision requires preparation. The person who speaks imprecisely does so because they haven't clarified their own thinking. They use 10 words where one would suffice because they're thinking out loud rather than thinking ahead. But the precise communicator has already done the mental work of distilling their message to its essence. Machiavelli's own writing demonstrates this principle. The Prince isn't a lengthy philosophical treatise. It's a collection of precise observations and surgical advice. Each sentence carries weight because unnecessary words have been eliminated. This precision is what made his insights timeless. When you communicate precisely, you achieve several psychological advantages. First, your words are easier to remember. The human brain retains simple, clear messages better than complex, verbose ones. Second, your statements are harder to misinterpret. Precision eliminates ambiguity, which eliminates opportunities for confusion or manipulation. Third, precision suggests confidence. When someone can express a complex idea in simple terms, it demonstrates mastery of the subject. When someone needs many words to explain something simple, it suggests they don't fully understand it themselves. Here's how to develop surgical communication. Before speaking, ask yourself, what's the minimum number of words needed to convey this message effectively? Then cut your initial response in half. Most people's first instinct is to over-explain. Train yourself to under-explain instead. Use statements instead of questions when possible. We need to finish this project by Friday is more influential than, do you think we could possibly finish this project by Friday? Questions invite debate. Statements assume compliance. Replace weak qualifiers with strong declaratives. Instead of I think, maybe we should consider, say we will. Instead of it's possible, that say this is. Instead of I believe, simply state the belief as fact. Eliminate filler words and phrases, like, you know, basically, actually. These verbal crutches dilute your message and communicate uncertainty. Record yourself speaking and count how many filler words you use. Then practice eliminating them completely. The goal isn't to become robotic or cold. It's to ensure that every word you speak carries maximum weight. When people know that you don't waste words, they listen more carefully to the words you choose. The ability to read social dynamics and choose silence over speech is perhaps the most sophisticated influence skill you can develop. Most people talk when they should listen, explain when they should observe, and argue when they should withdraw. But the strategically silent person watches, learns, and strikes only when conditions are perfect. Every conversation has an underlying power dynamic. Someone is leading, someone is following, someone is comfortable, someone is nervous, someone knows more, someone knows less. The person who speaks less often has a clearer view of these dynamics because they're observing rather than performing. Watch what happens in group conversations. The people who talk the most are often the least influential. They're competing for attention rather than commanding it. Meanwhile, the person who speaks occasionally but precisely often ends up directing the entire discussion through carefully placed observations. Machiavelli understood this principle in political contexts. In court situations, the advisor who spoke constantly was seen as desperate for the ruler's attention, but the advisor who remained quiet until asked for counsel was seen as wise and measured. Silence suggested that they had something valuable to say, but were selective about when to say it. There are specific moments when silence is more powerful than any words you could choose. When someone is angry and trying to provoke you, silence denies them the reaction they're seeking. When someone is lying and embellishing their story, silence makes them increasingly uncomfortable and likely to reveal the truth. When someone is trying to pressure you into a decision, silence communicates that you won't be rushed. The key is learning to distinguish between comfortable silence and uncomfortable silence. Comfortable silence happens when everyone in the conversation is at ease with the pause. This type of silence is fine to break with appropriate commentary, but uncomfortable silence, when others are fidgeting, rambling, or showing signs of nervousness, should be maintained. This discomfort often leads to valuable revelations. Strategic silence also involves knowing when to exit conversations entirely. The person who always has the last word often loses the argument. Sometimes the most powerful response is to simply walk away, leaving your previous statement hanging in the air without further elaboration. This requires enormous self-control. Your ego wants to respond to provocations. Your insecurity wants to fill awkward pauses. Your social conditioning wants to be polite and keep conversations flowing. But influence requires sacrifice, and sometimes that sacrifice is the immediate gratification of having your say. When you master the art of reading rooms and choosing silence appropriately, you develop what appears to be supernatural social intuition. People start assuming you understand things they don't, that you're operating on a different level of awareness. This reputation for mysterious insight becomes a source of ongoing influence. The most elegant form of influence isn't convincing people with your words. It's letting them convince themselves with theirs. This is verbal jujitsu, using the momentum of someone's own arguments to guide them toward your desired conclusion. You don't push against resistance, you redirect it. Here's how it works. Instead of presenting counter-arguments, you ask questions that expose weaknesses in their position. Instead of stating your opinion, you guide them to discover problems with their own. Instead of defeating their logic, you let their logic defeat itself. The technique starts with active listening, not listening to respond, but listening to understand the structure of their argument. Where are the weak points? What assumptions are they making? What contradictions exist within their position? Once you identify these vulnerabilities, you can use strategic questions to highlight them. That's interesting. How do you think that would work in practice? I see your point. What would happen if everyone did that? That makes sense. How does that align with what you said earlier about? These aren't confrontational questions. They're exploratory questions that guide the other person to examine their own position more critically. Machiavelli used this technique masterfully in his diplomatic work. Rather than directly opposing other negotiators, he would ask questions that revealed the impracticality or inconsistency of their demands. He let them talk themselves into corners, then offered reasonable alternatives that looked generous by comparison. The psychological principle behind this is simple. People are more convinced by conclusions they reach themselves than by conclusions others reach for them. When you directly argue against someone's position, you trigger their defensive mechanisms. But when you guide them to question their own position, they're more likely to change their mind. This technique also preserves relationships. Direct confrontation creates adversaries. Socratic questioning creates collaborative problem solving. The other person doesn't feel defeated by your superior arguments. They feel enlightened by their own deeper thinking. Verbal jujitsu requires patience. You can't rush the process. You have to let people work through their own contradictions at their own pace. But this patience pays off because the conclusion feels like their idea rather than your imposition. The most advanced practitioners can guide entire conversations without ever stating their own position explicitly. They become invisible influences, shaping outcomes through carefully crafted questions and strategic silences. Others walk away feeling like they made their own decisions, never realizing they were subtly guided towards specific conclusions. This isn't manipulation if used ethically. It's actually a form of respect. Respecting others' intelligence enough to let them think through issues rather than telling them what to think. But it requires discipline to resist the urge to simply state your opinion directly. There's something about brevity that communicates authority. When someone can express complex ideas in few words, it suggests they've mastered the subject so thoroughly that they can distill it to its essence. When someone needs many words to explain simple concepts, it suggests uncertainty and confusion. Authority figures throughout history have understood this principle. Military commanders don't give lengthy speeches before battle. They give brief, clear orders. CEOs don't write 20-page memos. They send concise directives. Judges don't deliver rambling verdicts. They state their decisions precisely. Brevity communicates several things simultaneously: competence, confidence, and respect for others' time. When you can say what needs to be said without unnecessary elaboration, you demonstrate that you understand both your subject and your audience. You show that you value efficiency over verbosity. The psychological impact of brevity is profound. When someone speaks briefly, but substantively, listeners assume that every word has been carefully chosen. They pay closer attention because they sense that nothing is wasted. This attention translates into influence, because focused attention is the prerequisite for persuasion. Machiavelli's advice to princes was notably brief. He didn't write 1,000-page manuals on governance. He wrote short, sharp observations that could be quickly understood and immediately applied. This brevity didn't diminish his authority. It enhanced it. Leaders could read his advice quickly and remember it clearly. Contrast this with how most people communicate in professional settings. Long emails that could be 3 sentences. Meetings that stretch simple decisions into hour-long discussions. Presentations that repeat the same points multiple times. All of this excess communication actually weakens rather than strengthens the message. Brief communication also has practical advantages. It's easier to remember, easier to share, and harder to misinterpret. When you give someone a simple, clear directive, they're more likely to follow it correctly than if you give them complex, detailed instructions that they might misunderstand. But brevity requires preparation. You can't be brief without first understanding your subject thoroughly. You can't distill a message to its essence without knowing what that essence is. This is why brief communication often takes more effort than verbose communication. You have to do the thinking work up front. The key is distinguishing between brevity and incompleteness. Brief communication includes all necessary information, but eliminates unnecessary elaboration. Incomplete communication leaves out important details. The goal is to say everything that needs to be said, but nothing more. When you master the authority of brevity, people start treating your words as valuable. They listen more carefully, remember more clearly, and comply more readily. Your communication becomes a precision instrument rather than a blunt force tool. Let's examine the specific verbal behaviors that destroy your influence, often without you realizing it. These are the subtle communication mistakes that make people tune you out, lose respect for you, or dismiss your ideas before you've finished expressing them. The first killer is over-explanation. When you make a point and then immediately elaborate on it, explain why you believe it, provide examples, offer context, and anticipate objections, you're diluting your original statement. Strong statements stand alone. When you immediately undermine them with qualifications and explanations, you communicate doubt about your own position. The second killer is defensive language. I'm not trying to be difficult, but maybe I'm wrong, but I could be mistaken. But these verbal hedges are intended to soften your statements, but they actually signal that you don't fully believe what you're saying. If you don't believe it, why should anyone else? The third killer is question statements. We should probably finish this project by Friday. I think we need to have this conversation. When you turn statements into questions through vocal inflection, you're asking for permission to have an opinion. This immediately positions you as subordinate to whoever you're speaking with. The fourth killer is emotional leakage. When your voice gets higher under pressure, when you speak faster when nervous, when you laugh nervously after making serious points, you're communicating emotional instability. People follow emotional strength, not emotional fragility. The fifth killer is reactive communication, responding immediately to provocations, defending yourself against accusations, correcting every misstatement others make about you. This reactive pattern makes you appear defensive and gives others control over the conversation. They say something, you react. They control the agenda. Machiavelli observed all of these patterns in court settings. The advisors who over-explained were seen as uncertain. The ones who used defensive language were seen as weak. The ones who turned statements into questions were seen as subordinate. The ones who leaked emotion were seen as unstable. The ones who reacted to every provocation were seen as easy to manipulate. The sixth killer is unnecessary agreement. You're absolutely right, and I totally agree, but that's a great point. However, when you agree before disagreeing, you're weakening your disagreement. If their point was great, why are you arguing against it? Pick a position and hold it cleanly. The seventh killer is verbal inflation, using complex words when simple ones would suffice, using 10 words when 3 would work, adding unnecessary qualifiers to straightforward statements. This doesn't make you sound smarter, it makes you sound insecure about your intelligence. Recognition is the first step to elimination. Start monitoring your own speech for these patterns. Record important conversations or presentations and analyze them afterward. Most people are shocked when they discover how many influence-killing habits they've developed. The final evolution of speaking less and influencing more isn't just about reducing your word count. It's about developing such mastery over communication that your presence alone becomes influential. This is the realm of nonverbal authority, where silence becomes more powerful than speech. When you've mastered these principles, something shifts in how others perceive you. Your rare words carry weight because people know you don't waste them. Your silence creates anticipation because people know that when you speak, it will be worth hearing. Your presence commands attention because you've trained others to value your input. This transformation requires consistent practice. You can't occasionally apply these principles and expect them to work. People need to learn that this is who you are. Neil, someone who speaks deliberately, listens actively, and chooses silence strategically. Once they understand this pattern, they adjust their behavior accordingly. Machiavelli understood that the most powerful communication wasn't verbal at all. It was behavioral. The prince who consistently acted with restraint and spoke with precision became known for these qualities. People anticipated his words, respected his silence, and interpreted his actions through the lens of his established character. The ultimate goal is to reach a point where your influence operates independently of your immediate presence. When people quote your rare but memorable statements in your absence, when they pause, to consider what you might think before making decisions. When your reputation for thoughtful communication precedes you into every room, this level of influence requires patience. Our culture rewards quick responses, immediate opinions, and constant engagement. But sustainable influence comes from the opposite approach: delayed responses, considered opinions, and selective engagement. You're playing a longer game than most people around you. The paradox of mastering influential silence is that you become more genuinely confident when you're not constantly trying to prove yourself through words. When you're not explaining or defending or convincing, you develop actual certainty about your position. This certainty radiates from you and affects everyone around you. You also become a better thinker. When you're not immediately verbalizing every thought, you have time to develop those thoughts more fully. Your ideas become more sophisticated because they've had time to mature before being expressed. Your insights become deeper because they've been tested internally before being shared externally. The person who has mastered speaking less and influencing more becomes a gravitational force in social and professional situations. Others orbit around their rare but valuable contributions. Their silence creates space for others to reveal themselves. Their words, when they come, reshape entire conversations. This isn't about becoming antisocial or mysterious for its own sake. It's about understanding that true influence comes from substance, not volume. Quality over quantity, precision over proliferation, depth over frequency. When you master these principles, you don't need to speak often to be heard clearly.